Hello everyone, hopefully you can hear me. Thank you very much for all of your interest and support. It's been unexpected, but we really appreciate it. So my name's Sebastian. I'm sales manager at Congress Rental Australia. Today we're going to be going through, basically we'll start with interpretation, then we're going to take a look at remote interpretation. But basically, first of all, I just wanted to say, I know everyone's pretty quiet at the moment, and that's us included. So we really wanted to just take the time to, share some of our knowledge, because it's a pretty niche topic. A lot of people kind of, see this as a little bit of a dark art. So we just kind of wanted to spread a bit of knowledge, kind of share what we know, and hopefully some people can gain something out of this. So a little bit of housekeeping. We do have colleagues on. Some of my colleagues are on standby. They're going to monitor the Q&A throughout the event. We'll take some breaks to answer some of those questions, as well as at the end, and then hopefully by the end of it we should have gotten through all of those questions. So as I mentioned, this is the first webinar. We're going to kind of take a step back, look at what interpretation is, obviously from the perspective of an equipment supplier, and then we're going to kind of relate that into what is remote interpretation and the use cases of remote interpretation. Next week we are holding a second webinar. It's going to be a more detailed look at our remote interpretation platform. It's actually going to be hosted on our remote platform with live interpretation provided by Macquarie University students. So they're the future interpreters. We have to thank them for donating their time. Everyone is working from home, them included, so they will be working remotely and interpreting remotely. So it should be quite cool to listen to some live interpretation from future interpreters. Sorry. All right, let's proceed. So. Most people know us for interpretation, conference microphones, and silent conference, but we actually started in 1976 as a division within Philips. Jeremy Ducklin, our managing director, bought it from them in 2000 and started Congress Rental as we know it today. Besides Australia, we're in the Sydney office today, but besides Australia, we do have offices in Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, and most recently New Zealand. Shout out to my cousin Liam. We're part of a global network of similar companies called the Congress Rental Network. We all provide high quality equipment and train technicians, and they're available wherever you can access those, wherever a CRN partner is available all over the world. We talk about all of the stuff. We talk about remote interpretation, and if you ever have an event overseas, we can support you with their help through the CRN network. We've been working on remote interpretation for about 2 years now. We've seen some minor success, but of course with the current situation, it's become really relevant. But let's, as I mentioned, let's take a step back and kind of look at what interpretation is first before we move on to remote interpretation. So some of the larger events that we've supported include ASEAN Sydney in 2018, APEC PNG in 2018, and G20 in 2014. But of course, we support events of all sizes on a day-to-day basis, so no events too small or too large for us. We love getting involved in anything where relevant. So what is interpretation? So before we talk about interpretation, how about we talk about translation? So translation is actually text. So, the translation of text from one language to another. A lot of our clients actually get in touch and ask for translation, but we know what they really mean, which is interpretation. So what is interpretation? That's actually spoken word from one language to another. So simultaneous interpretation is when an interpreter listens to a speaker and then interprets in near real time. So consecutive interpretation is when one speaker speaks, the interpreter interprets immediately after. That's called consecutive. But specifically, we deal with conference simultaneous interpretation. So that requires a high level of training for the interpreters. There's a lot of pre-event preparation to ensure that they, know know all the specific jargon required for any given topic. An event is not just a general meeting. Usually it's about a pretty specific topic. So there's a lot of preparation involved. And while the conference interpreters often speak multiple languages, when they're working in an event, they will work in two languages. For example, an English and Spanish interpreter. In Australia, most of the time we see English as our base language, and then the interpreters will work from English into a second language. So on-site equipment interpretation. The equipment for conference simultaneous interpretation is where we come in. We utilise specialised AV hardware designed specifically for this purpose. A standard event setup consists of floor or source audio, which could consist of a speaker or multiple speakers, video content with spoken word, anything like that. This is sent to us from the on-site AV team, and then we feed that to the interpreters working inside a soundproof booth. The interpreters listen to the floor language and they will interpret into their second language. A quick little example, we're at an event, someone is presenting in Spanish on the floor, the interpreter inside the booth will listen to Spanish and then they will interpret into English. Then the delegates at the event will listen to the English interpretation using headsets, but we'll go further into that shortly. We can take it one step further when we talk about language relays. This is where it can kind of get really complicated at an event. A language relay is required for events where 3 or more languages are spoken. So if we look at the earlier example of a Spanish speaker, we have our Spanish speaker on the floor who's speaking, but we also have some English and French speakers in the audience. So what we require is some English and French interpreters in the room. So that's great, but we have a Spanish speaker on the floor. So what happens is we have our Spanish speaker on the floor, the Spanish to English interpreters listen to the Spanish, interpret into English, the French-English interpreters listen to the English interpretation, and then interpret into French for the French delegates in the room. It can get really complicated, but it's really rewarding to see it in action. That's one of the kind of detailed pieces of knowledge that we have. So a typical setup for us, so our everyday event that requires interpretation consists of ISO compliant booths. So ISO compliant means they reach and exceed the standards for soundproofing and comfort for the interpreters. We use Audipack booths only. We source them from Europe, very high quality. Our equipment, we use Bosch digital infrared equipment. This is the best quality, most reliable hardware out there on the market for this use. All Congress Rental Network partners are required to utilise ISO compliant booths and Bosch hardware. This pretty much ensures the quality anywhere in the world. So the interpreters listen to the audio and interpret into a Bosch interpreter console. So that sits on the desk inside the booth, and that consists of a microphone that they can speak into. The language feeds are distributed via digital infrared, which is the highest quality wireless audio available. So if you can see on the photo provided, there's some Bosch radiators on top of the booth that actually transmit the audio channels or the signal, infrared signal. The number of these radiators is determined by the size of the area, so the amount of space we need to cover with signal, as well as the number of languages. So the more languages there are, the more radiators we need to fill that space with signal. Infrared is physical light, of course, so it doesn't penetrate walls, which adds an additional layer of security for events that require it. The delegates at the event use a Bosch digital infrared headset, and they use that to listen to their language as we kind of touched upon earlier. So I can already see some questions coming in, so we're going to take a quick break. I can see the guys already writing them down. So we've got, do you think remote interpretation will accelerate the use of artificial intelligence in conferences and therefore making human interpreters obsolete or at least less relevant? Look, this is something that we get asked all the time. We actually get clients who call up and don't even realise that there is a person sitting inside the booth. They think a computer does the interpretation for them. So what we found is, in our experience at least, I'm sure there's other people who know much more about this, but from our experience, AI is still a long way off providing simultaneous interpretation. You need to realise or think about a standard event is pretty detailed when it's talking about one topic. So, you know, it could be a medical conference, you know, specifically talking about diabetes. There's so many words and so much information in there that is so specific. To make an artificial intelligence that knows absolutely everything and can simultaneously interpret everything would be, you know, it's almost beyond belief at the moment. But then we can take it the next level. There's also emotion. So a sign of a really good interpreter is when you can hear the emotion of the speaker coming through the interpreter. You might have a speaker who's really angry on the floor. They're speaking a different language, so you might not be able to understand exactly what they're talking about, but then you hear the interpreter, and you can hear the interpreter is angry, and the interpreter passing on that emotion is something that I think is a little while off from AI. So yeah, look, I think it's a while away. Obviously never say never. Things change at a crazy rate at the moment. But I still think we're quite a while off, particularly when you're looking at some really high level events. I think people like the human touch. So I still think we're a little bit away from that. We do have a comment from someone saying AI cannot interpret nuances, especially in a classroom interactive environment. Yeah, precisely, kind of what we touched on earlier. So yeah, look, I still think we're a little while off, but you know, let's see what happens. All right, there is another question, but we'll come back to it later. We'll continue on, and because we are getting asked about remote interpretation, so how about we talk about remote interpretation, and then we'll start answering some questions. So remote interpretation essentially utilises the same principles as on-site simultaneous interpretation, but it allows additional configurations and some more flexibility for both the interpreters and the delegates. So our remote interpretation platform has a lot of integration possibilities. We can accommodate it to suit any situation, any event, any meeting. It can include on-site, off-site interpreters, or a combination of both. It could be on-site, off-site delegates, again, or a combination of both, and this includes the speakers as well. So practically any situation where interpretation could be required, you can utilise remote interpretation. So let's look at a really basic live event, kind of what we were talking about before. So we have a speaker talking to a group of people. That's the floor audio, and we send that over the cloud to the interpreters. So let's assume they're working remotely from home. So we will send the floor audio to the interpreters through the cloud. They then interpret into their second language, and then this interpretation is then sent back to the room via the cloud to their phones. So that's a very simple remote interpretation setup. But we need to remember that this can be used for anything. It's totally flexible. Let's have a look at a few examples here. So how about we look at the most relevant situation, or the most relevant type of meeting for what's happening right now, a conference call. This is what we're doing right now. Is it possible to integrate interpretation into a conference call? Absolutely, of course it is, with remote interpretation. So basically, for a call like this, we can integrate the interpreter. So the interpreter is working from home, just as we are. The interpreter watches the video call, they watch the conference call, they interpret into their second language, and then the delegates select the language to listen to. It's as simple as that. And then they're listening to either the floor in their language or the interpretation in their language. It's very simple, and we're actually going to be doing it next week, so you can actually have see how that goes. But for larger online meetings and events or webinars, we have a slightly different solution. It's called Congress Remote Classroom. Basically, it's where we have a larger audience and everyone has the ability to talk. And so in order to do that, we have a chairperson who allocates the live speaker. Someone wants to speak, so they put their digital hand up, and then the chairperson allows them to talk. And just as we mentioned before, the interpreter listens to them speak, interprets into their second language, and then everyone in the crowd, no matter what language they're listening in, can listen to the event in their language. Of course, for both of these scenarios, the interpreters will have a video feed of the conference call, so they will see the active speaker, and in a scenario like this, they can still see the PowerPoint slides. This is crucial for interpretation on-site or off-site. I can see a load of more questions coming in. Let's stop and work through them. It's going to take a while. I can see the guys are having a hard time keeping up with everyone. So thank you for participating and keep sending them in. Let's make them work hard. So I'll start from the top. What's my prediction on the outlook of remote interpretation and on-site interpretation post current pandemic? This is just my personal opinion. I think domestic events will come back first. There's still interpretation required for domestic events, so there's still going to be some need for on-site interpretation. But obviously, with what's going on, international travel, it's hard to even see it coming back on the horizon. I still think it's a while off. So I think remote interpretation is going to be crucial. We're already seeing, everyone has already seen everyone take their event online. And there's a lot of people out there who don't want to cancel their event just because they have multiple languages. And this is where remote interpretation comes in. And I think the fact that people are working from home, people kind of realise that it's not so scary having interpreters working from home. So look, I think remote interpretation is going to be on the up, but I certainly don't think it's going to be the death of on-site interpretation. There's still a really important place for that. Would I like to demonstrate the remote interpretation platform? What will be the quote and the requirements to use the platform? I think I might hang on to that for next week. So next week we're going to host it on the platform. You'll be on the platform with live interpreters, so you can switch the channel to listen to Mandarin, for example. Even if you don't speak it, you can still hear it in real time just to hear the audio quality. In terms of everything else, specs and pricing, let's have a look at that next week. We will be talking about that stuff. I've already prepared for that. How do we convince a client to use real interpreting platform and not something like Zoom? Look, the biggest thing is a proper remote interpretation platform has been designed for this use. For example, looking at something like Zoom, it's not built for the interpreters. Really, just quick off the top of my head, you can't have two interpreters working on Zoom. So something I probably should have mentioned earlier is typically you'll have two interpreters working on an event, whether it's on-site or off-site. And the reason being is they work in short 15-minute shifts because interpreting is quite hard work. And so if they don't have the ability to work in pairs, I think you're going to struggle to find an interpreter that's willing to support your event. There's so many other reasons as well. Low latency, high audio quality. I'm not sure if you can tell, but we've been doing our own office meetings on Zoom. The quality of the audio and video is acceptable. But it's certainly not, I wouldn't say it's acceptable for interpreters to work an 8-hour event using compressed audio like that. Likewise with the video, the quality's just not there. Using a proper platform will give you proper results. So look, to convince a client to do it, just say, if you don't have the proper platform, there will be effects. The delegates will tell the difference. And if they don't do it, then you'll find out about it soon enough. How secure is remote interpretation? Again, we're going to look at this next week. So I might ask Mason, can you save that question for next week and we'll come back to it? So we've got a lot of specs about the back-end security. So I'm going to put that on hold and I want to discuss it next week. So I promise we'll come back to that next week. Do we expect a time delay when the sound clip is sent via cloud? Okay, so essentially what's the delay over remote interpretation through the cloud? So I know on our platform we're looking at 5 milliseconds delay, which when you factor in the processing time of the interpretation in the interpreter's brain, it's probably more than that. So for the delegate sitting in the room, you've got 5 milliseconds up, you've got the interpreter thinking about it and then interpreting, and then another 5 milliseconds down. For the delegates sitting in the room, next to nothing. They're not going to know the difference. We even sometimes joke that half the time the delegates wouldn't even know if there was an interpreter in the room or not. Some events we can't fit the booths and the interpreters in the room, so we have to put them in rooms next door or other rooms in the building. And again, the delegates wouldn't even know there were interpreters in the building or working from home. So I don't think latency is too much of an issue. But again, we'll talk about this next week. Security for our cloud solution, again, I think let's save that for next week. It's pretty similar to the previous question talking about security. But look, we totally understand that confidentiality and security is a pretty big topic, especially for some of these meetings and events. As I mentioned, we do a lot of government events, so it is very important we understand. But we'll talk about the specs and what we've done for that next week. In terms of strategy, what do we suggest? What do you suggest we can anticipate business-wise for the rest of 2019? What country do you think will start hosting conferences again? Okay, well, this sounds like a kind of more of an events question rather than interpretation. So we've already heard from Korea a few times, people wanting to come to Australia or hosting their events in Korea for with remote interpretation. So it sounds like they're doing quite well. Everything else I'd talk about would be coming from the news. So for example, it was quite interesting early on, we were using Singapore as an example for what Australia needs to do in terms of kind of getting through this. But as we all know now, Singapore subsequently went into a harsher lockdown than what they originally had. But things are pretty positive in our Singapore office, so things are happening there. But look, I don't want to, toot our own trumpet, but it sounds like Australia's doing pretty well. People are talking, people are already contacting us. And I think throughout this whole thing, what was really good to hear is people weren't necessarily cancelling their events. They were more postponing until later in the year, or, we don't know when we can hold it, but we definitely want to hold it. So I think the situation in Australia is pretty positive. Unfortunately, it does feel like it's down to the government's response to how quickly things can kind of come back to life for the events industry. So I guess we all just have to keep an eye on it and see how we go. Can you use Congress Remote Classroom for training purposes? Absolutely. As I mentioned, we have Congress Remote Classroom. So that allows a chairperson, or I guess you could call the chairperson a teacher, that selects an active speaker. And then even if people in the classroom don't all speak one language, you can integrate remote interpretation. All the delegates need to do is select the language they want to participate in, and then they're either listening to the active speaker in their language or the interpreter in their language. So throughout the whole event, they listen in their language. So absolutely, you could use it for a classroom situation. Can I expand on Congress Remote Classroom? Absolutely. How many languages, number of participants, can people see each other, muting languages, etc.? Yeah, so Congress Remote Classroom is, would you be able to put that back? Yeah, all good. Sorry, I know I'll forget some of the parts of it. All right, Congress Remote Classroom, how many languages? My understanding is we can keep adding languages, so as many languages as you need for the event. Obviously, you just get the right interpreters for those languages and away you go. Number of participants, I'll need to get that next week as part of the slideshow. But as far as I know, it's a pretty high number, and the chairperson can just allocate the active speakers. It's similar to a Zoom call. I know we haven't got allowed on this room, but you can. So basically, there's a put your hand up where the speakers put their hand up, and then the chairperson decides to let them be an active speaker. Then their video shows up, their audio video if they allow it, and that means everyone in the meeting can actually see the active speaker. If it's a Congress classroom, the muting is both on the chairperson, so the chairperson allocates someone to speak, but they can also kick people off, but then also the delegate has their own options to mute. Languages, as I said, it's like all the rest of the remote platform. You select a language to listen in, and then you're either listening on the floor if it's your language, or you're listening to the interpreter if the floor needs to be interpreted. All right, so I think we're going to pause here. There's heaps more questions, so we're planning on doing an hour, but at this rate, we could be here all afternoon. But look, that's a good thing. Happy to kind of make sure everyone's happy, get their questions in, and I think we can all learn from this. It's super interesting. So we'll move on, and we'll come back to some more questions later. So let's go back to live events. If we can remember, back in the day when in-person events were a thing. So live events with remote interpretation. I already talked about the basic configuration. You have a speaker, you have a presenter or multiple presenters or a pre-recorded video. And that is sent via the cloud to the interpreters, who then interpret into their second language, and then the delegates listen. But there's flexibility in that. There's many ways that we can support an event. So the most basic way that we can become flexible with that is, for whatever reason, we may not be able to support streaming of the interpretation on so many devices, whether it's internet capability or network hardware capability, whatever it is, we do have a solution. We can integrate the remote languages into the infrared headsets, and then the delegates have a physical handset. That's one way. Basically, any style event, you can have a combination of off-site and on-site interpreters, interpreters working in the event in a booth, and interpreters working from home. I did mention earlier, no matter what the event is, if the interpreters are in the building but in a different room or working from home, they will always require a video feed. That's so they can see the active speaker. It obviously helps when you see someone talk. When you listen to someone, you also need to see them talk. That's a big part of listening to someone talk. But as well as that, there's also PowerPoint and video feeds. So with the remote platform, we will always guarantee there's a video feed to the interpreters, as well as content feeds. So most of the time we'll request that from the ONSITE AV. We'll take a video feed from the ONSITE AV. But if that isn't available, we can provide small form factor cameras so the interpreters can have a view of the remote event the whole time. So yeah, I already touched upon smartphone streaming and hybrid solutions. There's a couple of more examples on that. A real world example, why would you have on-site and off-site interpreters? You may host an event where there's some uncommon languages. Say you may host an event with some Mandarin, Japanese, and then Khmer. So there's Mandarin and Japanese interpreters widely available in a lot of capital cities, but finding Khmer interpreters can be a bit of a challenge. So the way we can do that is have the interpreters that are available to work on site, but also have the uncommon interpreters working remotely. So they can work internationally, work from home overseas, and they can still participate in the event. And that also allows the delegates of that uncommon language to speak. So if someone on the floor of the event spoke Khmer, the interpreter would hear that and then interpret into the floor language. In Australia, that would be English, to allow everyone else in the room to understand what is being said. Another example of hybrid, you can have on-site interpreters, however you can still have the interpretation streamed to phones. Now why would you do that? Many reasons. You might have the interpreters who can't fit in the room. They need to work from a small room back of house or a different room in the building. We can have them working on the remote platform, even though they're still in the same room, and then have the interpretation streamed to phones. Another example here, a hybrid situation. You can have on-site or remote interpreters, and then you can have the interpretation streamed to off-site delegates. So you may have on-site delegates that speak multiple languages, but you might want to expand your event out to other delegates who can't travel, like we're experiencing right now. You can stream the event video and audio, or just the audio, to delegates all over the world in any language. And again, you can utilize on-site interpreters or remote interpreters. I think the most important thing here is it's super flexible. Any scenario, any situation, it can be accommodated with remote interpretation. Let's move on to what are some of the important features of a remote interpretation platform. Now, I know we're getting a lot of questions about this type of stuff, and next week is a deep dive on our platform, but let's touch on some really important features of a remote interpretation platform versus, I guess, a standard platform. So one of the most important things is high quality audio. This is not just for just the interpreters or just the participants, it's for both. So the interpreters require high quality audio. If they're working a really long time, a really long day on a tough event with hard words, really specific information, it helps them to work with nice clear audio. They can understand everything that's said. And then for the delegates, if they have to sit there for 9 hours a day, 8-9 hours a day listening to some interpretation, you want that to be high quality audio. There is a phrase, you can get tired ears. If you listen to low quality audio, that's really apparent, and that's a big thing for remote interpretation. Low latency, we already touched on that. It is crucial though, if you don't have low latency and the delay is really big, for example, you might have half the room starting to clap because the speaker is finished, but the interpreter hasn't finished because they're hearing a delayed feed. So it's really important that there is low latency, so there's a just minimal delay between the people listening to the interpretation, but also for the interpreter, so they can interpret as quick as possible. Ease of use, I think this applies to pretty much everything. If it's too hard, the delegates won't like it. If it's too hard, the interpreters won't like it. It's for the delegates, it's as simple as either logging in or going on the app, choosing the language, and then away they go. They sit on that language throughout the event and they listen in that language. That's super important. If it becomes too hard, people just don't have a good time and they just won't want to come back to it. And then interpreter-specific functions. Again, we touched on this with other platforms that aren't really designed with interpreters in mind. It's really important that the interpreters are looked after. If the interpreters are struggling to work, the delegates are going to hear that, they're going to feel it, and it's just the interpreters will have a bad time, the delegates will have a bad time. It's just not an ideal solution. All right, and one other thing I should mention, with on-site equipment, we'll always have our technician on-site to monitor. So our technician will monitor the language feeds to ensure that the interpreters are outgoing on the correct channel. But this also applies to remote interpretation. We will have a technician monitoring. We have a special back-end page. We can actually flick through and monitor the interpreters' channels, but we can also chat specifically with the interpreters to make sure they're happy, find out if they have any issues. And again, this is something we're going to touch on next week, but we do have specific chat functions within our platform. So we have an overall event chat function, and we also have an interpreter-to-interpreter chat function, so they can talk to their language partner, which is really important. We can't understate that. Communication between language partners is absolutely crucial. Talk to any interpreter. Benefits of remote interpretation. I think besides being able to support any type of event and be super flexible, why else would you use remote interpretation? So pretty much, I think the biggest thing, and one of the most common reasons in Australia, is it means you can hold your event in faraway places, and that's not too hard to do in Australia. Most places in Australia are far away. And often there aren't local interpreters who speak that language. So this enables you to hold your event in one of those cities, but still have interpretation. So you can still have those delegates from overseas or delegates that speak different languages participate and listen to your event. So how would that work? For example, you might want to hold your event in Perth or Darwin or Hobart. There's a big cost in flying the interpreter. There's accommodation, there's per diems. There's a big saving in having the interpreter work from home. They can log into the event beforehand, work at the event, and then away they go. Oops, sorry, we've lost our presentation. Apologies. So yeah, basically interpreters can work on any event, and I guess this goes into our next point. There's a bit of a cost saving. There's no travel, no accommodation, no per diems, and obviously there's a little bit of saving in not having to freight all that hardware around. So cost saving and the ability to hold your event in remote places is certainly a massive reason to go for remote interpretation. Another thing is you can access professionals. So one of the things in talking to the interpreters in Australia, so we're a member of numerous groups, the Australasian Association of Language Companies, sorry Tia, AALC. So, just speaking to groups of interpreters like that, we hear about the high level and high standards of interpreters in Australia, and that's a pretty sought after thing. I don't think people think about that very often. You can go to a country where there are no high quality interpreters, and that really negatively affects your event, having an event with a low quality interpreter or an inexperienced interpreter. So having the ability to hold your event anywhere and still access really high quality interpreters is such a massive thing. I think it's going to be one of the biggest drivers of remote interpretation, in the not too distant future. But on the flip side of that, it also enables Australian interpreters to work on international events. So as I mentioned, we have really high standards, and the interpreters in Australia need to be really qualified and highly skilled to work on events. And they don't have the same kind of standards and expectations in some other countries, not all other countries, just some. And so there will be a demand for high quality interpreters for really important events, and it enables interpreters in Australia or anywhere in the world really to put their hand up and say, I have the skills, I have the quality, and I can support your event. All right. So one of the things we've been seeing now is, as I mentioned earlier, some people are cancelling their events because they can't travel or their delegates can't participate, but I don't think that has to exist, and I think this ties into how can remote interpretation reach a wider audience. It basically enables you to speak any language, communicate with any language, send out your message to anyone all over the world. So basically any event, presentation or meeting with travel bans can now have non-English speakers and participants, and it's really simple. Utilising interpreters who are also stuck at home, we can still hold those events. But basically expanding your event, you might hold an English-only event, but you can now expand that to, delegates that don't speak that one language. One other thing we're about to touch on as well, we can integrate with existing platforms. We know there are many companies that utilise a specific or single platform, and we can integrate interpretation with that. So just some quick examples: Skype, Zoom, WebEx, BlueJeans, GoToMeeting, all the ones here, or also just streaming a presentation to YouTube, Live, Vimeo, or any social media platform. We can integrate interpretation using remote interpretation. Of course, you can have interpreters in a studio and stream it, but you can use interpreters who are in lockdown, who are stuck at home, and you can integrate them into your online event. And that's really important, especially right now. We've all been forced to go online, but we want to expand that, and we want people to integrate interpretation into that. So this is really important. I'm going to go back to some questions because I can see them flying in. It's crazy. The guys are, wow. All right. I'm going to grab a drink and let's dig in. Okay. How do we ensure there is no downtime in terms of connection? All right. Perfect question. So we have thought long and hard. Can you keep them on there for a little second, just until I'm done? We thought long and hard about this. So, and again, I'm gonna keep saying it. I know, but we have prepared for next week as well. So we are going to touch on this next week. But just quickly, how to ensure there's no downtime. We do so much preparation and testing and training of the interpreters before a remote interpreter event to minimize any downtime. We have minimum specifications, so that includes computer specs, the quality of their hardware, their internet connection, so no Wi-Fi, always wired, all that kind of stuff. I won't go too deep into it because we're going to go deep next week, but we do absolutely everything in our power to minimize the risk of downtime in terms of connection. I'm very confident in saying we haven't experienced it yet, and that's because I think we've got lots of things in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we'll talk more about it next week. I'll keep saying it. Do you think it will have an impact on the work of interpreters? Look, I really hope the only impact it has is it enables them to support more events. Like I said, the interpreters we have here, and not just Australia, I should say the interpreters in Singapore, Indonesia, New Zealand, Philippines. I know they're really high quality, they're highly trained, and I know they exist all over the world. You do get what you pay for, so paying for a good interpreter is really crucial. So my hope is that events all over the world want to get these interpreters onto their event. So I guess unfortunately it would mean local interpreters will miss out on work, but my honest hope is that the local, high quality interpreters will gain work out of this, and will just become even more busy supporting events all over the world. Do we have a hub where interpreters can work? Absolutely. You're welcome to work in any of our offices all over the world. We have the hardware here, so we can set you up in a booth, whether you're working on old style hardware and we stream the interpretation feeds, or you're working on a laptop inside a booth, you are more than welcome to work with us. We can obviously provide the hardware and internet connections. So we've actually found that especially the interpreters we've worked with locally on remote events, we like to get them on and we get them working in our office for the first few events until they're really comfortable with the platform. Of course, we have support here, so get them on the platform working until they're really comfortable enough to work from home. So absolutely, you're more than welcome to work in our offices. What languages do we support? Any language. So we provide the hardware, so our hardware is not limited by language. The limitation on language are the interpreters. So essentially, there's no limit to the languages we can support. Get in touch; we'll help you out. Apparently, we've got a shout out to our Congress Rental Network partner in Serbia. So, hey guys, I hope you're keeping safe, and hopefully you can host the next seminar. We look forward to a webinar, I should say. We look forward to chatting with you soon. Can we compare our platform against Zoom? I think we should probably wait until next week. I have recently on a couple of demos, so it is easy just to start talking to people on Zoom. So we might hold a demo of our platform, but I'll usually start it on Zoom because everyone has Zoom and everyone understands. They get on it nice and easy and everyone's comfortable. But during the meetings, I have been switching over to our Congress Remote platform, and then I mute my Zoom and I start talking on the Congress Remote platform. And I've only done this, I can get the Macquarie students to verify this next week, but I've only ever done it with my AirPods. And so even with not recommended quality microphones, the person on the other end, it's just night and day between the Zoom audio and Congress Remote audio. I think the frequency is like full spectrum frequency, whereas Zoom's hyper compressed. Yeah, you'll hear it next week. So if you want to tune in next week, we'll use the same microphones, and then perhaps once we've done next week, we might be able to take a grab of this week's recording and then next week's recording, and we'll put them side by side, and we'll let you compare, the difference between Zoom and Congress Remote. Is there a limit for how many interpreters can work on a virtual event platforms like WebEx? That is a pretty platform-specific question. I'd say no. Like I mentioned earlier, it's super flexible. So if you have a requirement, we can come up with a solution for that requirement. And I know off the top of my head how we would do it. So I would just say no. There's no limit to the number of languages we can support with pretty much any platform out there. What about lip sync for the video stream to the interpreter? No issues. We've never seen an issue with that. Of course, that's really crucial. Not once have I ever heard an interpreter complain about that. So the back end is designed for that not to happen. I will mention that it does, what's the word? It's prioritizes the audio. So even if there's a bad connection somewhere along the line, so say, for example, you have a participant streaming the video and audio, if they have a drop in bandwidth, the video will drop first, so it will prioritize the audio. So no, I've never seen any issues with lip sync. The platform's designed that way. Can audience members speak during the online event? We can only find platforms where audience members can send messages. Absolutely, classroom style. So as I said, you can have a large audience of participants. The chairperson then selects an active speaker, or the people can put their hand up and the chairperson allows them to speak. So no, that's not an issue on our platform. Come talk to us, come on our platform. Anyone in the audience can speak. Chat and webcam, so talk to us. Shout out to CRN Africa. Hi guys, didn't forget about you. I'll come visit you one day. And was it Zanzibar we were talking about in Kuala Lumpur a few years ago? Nice to hear from you. What technical equipment does an interpreter need at home? Again, we're going to talk about this next week, but we are really picky, and the reason we're picky is because we want to make sure it's as stable as possible, but also the quality for the delegates is there. So I'll quickly touch on it. We need a decently spec'd computer. That's obviously so it doesn't drop out, it doesn't blue screen, doesn't conk out halfway through the event. A high quality microphone, so we never accept the built-in microphone. We do not accept the inline microphones on an iPod headphone, and always a wired internet connection. There are standards and tests we can do, and as I mentioned, we always log into the interpreter's computer beforehand. We always talk to them and we talk them through what we're doing and what we're looking at, but we do have a specific set of specs that we'll talk about next week. We'll go in detail about all of that. How do we deal with background noise and unreliability of internet connection in the interpreter's home office? So there's a lot of questions about, I've got a note here from Mason here saying there's a lot of questions about reliability and failures of the interpreter's home. So I think the first thing is wired. You're going to minimize, can you go back, sorry. You're going to minimize a lot of the problems by going wired. A lot of internet issues come from Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi dropouts. There's so much interference. You completely eliminate that by going wired. The next part of it is background noise. You know, that's a conversation to have with the interpreters. Do they live in an area with aeroplanes flying over? Do they live on a main road? We have that conversation with every interpreter. We log into their computer, we test, we make sure their audio sounds good, we make sure their microphone is up to scratch. If it's not, and we didn't provide the interpreter, the client provided the interpreter, we would suggest, hey, we need them to work in our office, or we need them to go work in your office because we're having issues, we're having these issues. We do a lot of testing to make sure that there aren't issues and background noise. Of course, there's times where you can't predict this stuff, but basically we have a checklist of things we go through with the interpreters that covers all of this stuff. So we do everything we can to minimize any of these potential issues. So yeah, and again, we'll talk about it next week. We'll talk about the steps we go through with the interpreters to minimize these risks. Can we record different interpreters on different tracks? Absolutely. So we get asked that more often than not. We can provide a recording of the event, whether it's fused into the video. So you might want, and I might mention this applies to on-site events as well, not just remote events. We can provide we call it a pure language feed. So that means if someone is speaking Mandarin on the floor, you will hear that on the recording. As soon as someone speaks a different language on the floor, the interpretation kicks in. So that recording will be a pure language recording. You'll hear one language throughout the recording, and that applies to remote interpretation as well. We can absolutely provide pure language recordings with remote. Do I think remote will become the preferred arrangement? I think for budget events and budget-conscious event organisers, yes, they will start to lean more on remote interpretation for all the benefits we talked about. For high quality, UN grade, government grade, all that kind of stuff, I think there will be hesitations for obvious reasons, security, all that kind of stuff, all of the reasons. So I think it'll eventually happen, but who knows when. I think remote interpretation will become more prevalent before artificial intelligence kind of comes around. I'm talking about simultaneous conference interpretation, not translations or anything like that. That's kind of a different topic. Is Congress Remote Classroom compatible with Mac, PC, and mobile devices? Absolutely. So it's all browser-based, all works on Chrome. You'll all get a login for next week. Everyone, we're going to request that you go on Chrome. It also works on mobiles. I'll touch on that. But yeah, Google Chrome browser, you log in to the platform, it asks you for an event code, you type in the event code, and by the way, the event code is specific to the type of login, so passive delegates will have a certain code, interpreters will have a certain code, that's how that's managed. And then there's the app you can log into, and again, use the same code, log on, select your language, and away you go. But like I said, we'll all jump on next week on the actual platform, so you can see it in action and have a look at all the buttons and functions and the quality of the audio. Do we organise interpreters directly? Absolutely. We have a lot of interpreter partners all over the world. We work with interpreters on a daily basis. I should say that interpreters are just as important to us as our clients, our end clients. Sometimes the interpreters are the clients, but we understand the importance of the interpreters being happy and comfortable in their working arrangements, and that reflects on us. If the interpreters aren't happy, they don't want to work with us. So we really prioritise the interpreter's situation, make sure they're happy. If they're happy, we're happy, the delegates are happy, the end client's happy. Sorry, I went on a tangent. Do we organise interpreters directly? Yes. Talk to us and we can help you out with that. Are clients asking you for a remote? Absolutely. Especially now, because we're all online. I don't think we can't, holding an in-person event is illegal. So yes, everyone is asking about remote interpretation right now. I guess one of the reasons we're holding the webinar and trying to talk about remote interpretation, because we know there are some people out there who don't know that it exists or just haven't really thought about it, and just might be interested to learn more. Absolutely, people are asking us about remote interpretation, but I think getting people to understand kind of all the various ways we can utilize it and integrate it into existing meetings, to expand them, to incorporate different languages is really important. So we're really trying to get that out there for the sake of the events industry and getting everyone involved all over the world. Can we have some concrete case studies? I'm going to save them for next week. So tune in next week. You'll be on the platform, using the platform, and you can hear about some of the events that we've supported. Has an AALC interpreter tried our platform? What is their feedback? Yes, and excellent. Absolutely, they have tried our platform. We were actually organising late last year to host, before all of the COVID-19 stuff happened, we were already going to organise a demo for AALC. We were going to host an actual AALC webinar. I'm not sure if you're an AALC member or not, but they host webinars, and we were going to host a specific webinar on remote interpretation along with some other topics. I talk to Tia regularly, so I'll talk to Tia and perhaps we can line up a big demo and get all the AALC members onto the platform and find out their feedback. But totally confident, I want them all to get on there so they can see how good it is. I guarantee they're going to love it. Do I find specific industries using remote interpretation more than others? Not necessarily industries. I think budget-conscious clients are more aware of it, probably because they're trying to find cheaper solutions. And with everything, there's positives and negatives. There are good reasons to have interpreters on site, and there are many good reasons to use remote interpretation. So I think, like I said earlier, budget-conscious event organisers are kind of the number one people that are starting to get onto it. But in saying that, because we're all forced to go online now, I think everyone is kind of asking about remote interpretation. So no, I don't think it's industry specific, but I do think it's probably, location specific at the moment. And again, kind of what I discussed earlier, if you're trying to hold your event in a remote place, that's a good reason to use remote interpretation. But also there's countries, so I'd say Europe and Asia seem to be taking up remote interpretation more. They kind of know a little bit more about it. So people coming from Europe and Asia seem to talk to us more about remote interpretation. I think we've got 5-ish minutes left. So I'm going to answer one more question and then we'll say our goodbyes just briefly. So is on-site interpreting still the best option? There's positives and negatives of both. Of course, if you have on-site interpreters, the risk factor is zero. They're there, they're going to work. Assuming you have high-quality interpreters on-site, you're good to go. You're going to have a good experience. But in saying that, with remote interpretation, we absolutely minimise the risks involved to the point where we say we're next to zero. So the risk to us is we're so confident with it, we're just not really fazed by that. But we understand event organisers are, So on-site interpreting, is it the best option? It depends, I think. It depends on where the event's held, budget, of course, how much does the event organizer want to spend on the event? How much do they have the budget to fly the interpreters, fly the equipment? And that's assuming it's in a remote place. For all we know, there could be local interpreters. And if there are local interpreters, a local hardware supplier, then you know what, maybe on-site would be the best solution for that. So I think you have to weigh up the options. And like I said, it's all positives, negatives, just whatever suits the event. Couple more shout outs. So our CRN partners are really getting into it. Shout out to CRN Spain and CRN New Zealand. I hope that's my cousin Liam. I'm assuming it's my cousin Liam, considering he's New Zealand. So I'm being told to wrap up. Didn't know if we'd make it the hour mark, but we made it. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Honestly, I must admit, when we started, we thought we would be talking to a select group of interpreters, but seeing the turnout is like it's pretty amazing, and I'm humbled, and I'm sure the team join me in feeling that, and they're pretty humbled too. So I'm going to wrap up. Like I said, thank you for watching. Special thank you to Mason, Barney and Jordan, who set up our little rig in the warehouse. I'm sure most of you know we're not a typical AV company, so but we do have some pretty cool hardware. So we've put together our own little studio, and I think they've done a really good job, and things went really well. So thanks to all the guys for making this happen. I keep talking about next week. So next week, we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to be on the platform. We're going to get everyone on the platform, speaking on the platform. We're going to have live simultaneous interpretation provided by Macquarie University interpretation students. So some of them will be working from home. Some of them are going to be working here in our office in a booth. So again, talking about those hybrid solutions, but definitely it's worth logging on. Even if you don't speak the different languages, you can still listen to me talk in English and then flick over and hear the Mandarin. If you haven't heard interpretation at an event, I think this will kind of really help demonstrate how it works. But even if you do know events, jump on next week, because this will get you on the platform and you'll see how it works. I'll answer all of those questions. We've made a note for the questions that we didn't get to that I kept saying we'll answer next week, and we'll talk about them. Like I said, we're going to talk about all of the stages. So before an event, talking to the interpreters, configuring their computer, all of that stuff about minimizing the risk. We're also going to talk about, the platform specifically, all the security features, all of those interpreter-specific functions that you don't find on other platforms. It's really important. So we're going to go through all of those next week. And I think that's everything. I do have another Q&A slide, but we're going to call it because it's 5 o'clock and I know we all want to go home, but we're already at home. So, what a conundrum we're in. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm touched by how many people kind of reached out and are supporting us, and even we were getting emails beforehand. So thank you to all of those people. Thank you so much for watching. Get in touch with any questions. We're here to give you a demo. We want to share our knowledge. So please talk to us. Thank you to the guys. Thank you, Jeremy. And hope to see you next week. Thank you. Bye.